Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and I'm in my office at Bathurst. A crisp winter day, but really, really lovely. And I've got Steve in my office. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
Steve Redhead. And what's your formal title, sir?
I'm Professor of Sports Media and Sub-Dean of Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts.
And now that first title is sort of the expertise we're going to deploy now, because, Steve, my question of you is about this new, interesting and emerging area, and this phrase is starting to appear in the literature. So, Steve, what is physical cultural studies?
Physical Cultural Studies, or PCS for short.
I'll stay classy.
It's already developing acronyms. Is an emerging refashioning of the area that perhaps used to be called Sociology of Sport. Sociology of Sport Journal, which actually published a special issue on physical cultural studies in 2011, really started this refashioning, and it's become something of a kind of brush fire. There is now a proposed Routledge Handbook of Physical Cultural Studies, 300,000 words, lots and lots of chapters of 5,000 words each, huge refashioning of the area, and if that gets published, which I think it will, the area may well change, and you'll get what used to be called Sociology of Sport or School of Human Movement will become something called Physical Cultural Studies if this refashioning really does develop in the direction I'm thinking. And certainly, I mean, I've been professor where there hasn't been a law school, because my original background was law and criminology. I've been a professor of sport and media cultures, as I was at University of Brighton, or professor of sports media, which I am at Charles Sturt University, my current university. And I think those sorts of areas are classically within this refashioning of physical cultural studies.
Now, let's get into this a little bit more. So, do you think this is a glib rebranding, noting that sociology at the moment is somewhat unpopular or undercooked, or students are not drawn to it? And obviously, your and my passion, the thing we absolutely adore, is cultural studies. We believe in it. But cultural studies in and of itself is in a dark night of the soul. So is this simply a rebranding of sociology of sport, or is it a proper reconnection, re-engagement, re-theorisation of cultural studies with sport and movement cultures as part of it?
I think it's a bit of both.
Right.
The rebranding of sociology of sport is probably long overdue, and the idea of a focus just on physical culture, and therefore a discipline called physical cultural studies. So
that's much beyond sport, for example. That's movement cultures.
I think it is.
Dance, exercise.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It goes through sport, dance, exercise, human movement, and so on. But that also allows a considerable expansion of the sort of disciplinary area. So you've got at one end, disability studies, queer studies, body studies.
Yes. As
well as more traditional sociology of sport. But I think the interesting thing is that sociology of sport did actually provide a kind of limiting label, because sociology itself, as you say, is changing. It has battles, and has various periodic battles with disciplines like cultural studies, but it is also much wider than just sport. And I think there is then perhaps a genuine refashioning of the area, and as I say, including new kinds of disciplinary approaches which really go right across the board. And it may well be that books like this Routledge Physical Cultural Studies Handbook will actually refashion the area in a good direction.
Look, I think it will, and one of the current projects that you and I are working on, and a great mate colleague of ours, in fact was my former PhD student, Dr. Leanne McRae, shout out to Leanne, we're looking at, in some ways, physical cultural studies in third-tier cities, or these small cities. Yeah. And I'm finding that label quite useful, because it's not simply organised sport in small cities. It's about movement cultures, those 10,000 steps a day, the pedometer cultures that exist. So I am finding that useful. Do you think it has some potential in policy studies as much as the textual or the contextual element that we associate with cultural studies?
I think that's one of its great strengths, really. I think that the refashioning will help in these policy areas, which again have been marginalised. You know, if they didn't fit the sociology of sport, for example, then they were marginalised, or if they didn't fit, say, creative industries, they were marginalised. But actually, there's in that particular study that we're doing, I think it wouldn't have fitted easily into these areas before, whereas it now does fit beautifully into physical cultural studies.
And final question, Steve, are you optimistic about the future, the trajectory of physical cultural studies, and where do you think it will lead? And will it loop back and create an iteration of cultural studies and sociology of sport, its originating paradigms?
Being from the north of England, I'm not very optimistic. I'm a pessimist usually. But actually, I am quite optimistic in this area. We have developed a small group of researchers at Charles State University, which includes us.
And a big shout out to Chelsea and to Jackie and to Matt, who are in that group. Called
Physical Cultural and Deb.
And Deb.
Physical Cultural Studies, PCS for short, which I think just shows that there is actually plenty of mileage in it, and it's happening. There are departments of physical cultural studies or clusters of physical cultural studies all over the world now, and there's lots of new interesting work. But I think in some ways you mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because one of the great strengths of sociology of sport, and it's clashing with cultural studies over the years, and what I call popular cultural studies at one time, rather ironically, tongue-in-cheek, is that you've got to keep up. You have got to develop theoretically, but you've also not got to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in many ways, you're still talking about classic sociology, classic cultural studies debates. We need to keep our mind on that, as well as developing a new field.
Yeah, so I hope this podcast has been useful for listeners. When I was thinking about doing this session with Steve, I particularly had my eyes and ears thinking about PhD students who are looking at a topic, who are interested in sport, or perhaps are interested in people moving, perhaps have an interest in fitness or obesity. Absolutely. Or how we get different groups with impairments or older citizens moving. And for me, as a PhD student, you've got to think about what's going to be big. And I suppose this podcast is signifying to who I hope will be our future colleagues that this area could be one to watch.
Definitely.
So thank you, Steve, for the conversation.
Thank you, Tara.